idea of consensuality or agreeing to something, and whether something can be defined as rape, or if one isn't prepared to say no, but experiences something that in hindsight is very damaging, how does that get addressed?
I'm almost wondering if you might be able to answer that better than
So I know most about how that looks at the university, but we do have 2 police officers here who might be able to talk about that from a legal perspective. To put you on the spot, you're welcome. However, from my understanding is if you've had a sexual experience and afterwards you feel like that wasn't okay, for the university at least, that is grounds to file the claim and to do an investigation into what happened. And at the university, you need to have affirmative consent to proceed in a sexual encounter. So if you're just laying there, for example, and aren't saying no, but you're not saying yes or you're not engaging, that is not consent at the university level. And I don't know about the laws at the state in that same regard, but and there are cases in which that we've heard in which that's sort of what's going on. And it's hard, and people involved have a hard time understanding what happened and unpacking it. People have to be really vulnerable to be willing to have those conversations and to look at that. But I don't know. Do either of you know much about how that works?
The Idaho rape laws is pretty archaic. Things have changed. There are situations where it's moved forward that if you're intoxicated or you're under the influence, there's a point where you can't consent. But it's very, very difficult to take to court. The law is not that clear. I'm getting ready to look it up here. If anybody had any questions about it, we could talk
Well,
about
while he's doing that, I should say that that is also the same at the university. So if you're intoxicated, if you've blacked out, if you've browned out, if you're too drunk to consent, that's another space where people may not say no, but clearly are not saying yes either. There's a movement for enthusiastic yeses. And so I don't actually know that much about it. Maybe the 2 of you can chime in, or even someone who knows more about it might. Yeah.
Sure. So actually, the Washington, revised code of Washington, RCW, does require an ongoing and obvious yes, basically. Enthusiastic consent before everybody got freaking out about California's law. Washington was there for like 4 or 5 years, and nobody paid attention because Washington's a lot smaller and there's a lot less money than California, and is less of a trendsetter than California is. And also, going back on the hindsight, like, oh, well, that wasn't okay. Most of the survivors that we work with don't necessarily think, when it first happens, I think Natalie's touched on this too, you don't know that it was abusive or assaultive. You're processing a lot of things, and you're processing it largely from a trauma center, your amygdala, which is not a very powerful part of your brain. It's a very useful part of your brain. It keeps you safe from a lot of things, but it doesn't keep things chronological, and it doesn't analyze things. And so if you want to learn more about that, you can check out Dr. Rebecca Campbell's Neurobiology of Trauma on YouTube. It's a brilliant talk. I recommend everybody watch it.
We watch this for everything usually.
Can you say it again?
Oh, Dr. Rebecca Campbell. It's the Neurobiology of Trauma.
Okay, thank you.
Rebecca?
Natalie, could you talk about how you feel that comprehensive sex and sexuality education might be able to address that situation? A lot of times we talk about how sex education will help people avoid being abused, or might help prevent that situation. But can you talk about how sexuality education might also educate people to look for affirmative consent?
Yeah, let me think for just a second about how I would answer that. I think that probably comes back to like a foundation of respect, and I think that is something that, like I talked about, has to happen from a young age in order for that to really set in. And I don't know if this is the direction that you're talking about, or kind of what you had in mind, but I think, can you ask the question one more time?
Yeah, I was just thinking about this, kind of sexuality education accessible to everybody.
Right.
How that could teach and encourage people not only to how to say no or give consent, but also encourage people to look for.
Oh, sure, okay, sorry, yeah, it's much clearer to me now. Yeah, absolutely, I think that, I listened to a program, This American Life, I don't know how many of you have heard of that, it's a program on NPR, it's a fantastic weekly thing that they do, it's amazing storytelling. And I was listening to one about sex education and it was primarily about how young men learn about sex and how they apply what they have learned from the sources they've learned it from in their lives. So this lady was going around to different college campuses and she was interviewing all these college students and she was interviewing the college freshmen. So these boys that were like fresh out of home, most of them are like 18, 19 years old, and they have sort of dove headlong into college life and they're having relationships, a lot of them for the first time having relationships. And she was talking to them about how they learned about sex, what consent meant to them, what it meant to them to communicate before, during, and after intimacy and that kind of thing. And it was really, really telling. And it was so many of these young men that she interviewed, were either extremely uncomfortable even talking about it, and yet they were sexually active, they were in relationships, but could not talk about it, they couldn't fathom that. And it was also something that felt very uncool to them to look for consent, probably because of the methods that they learned about sex and relationships from, these unrealistic kind of fantasy methods. So I think that because such a large percentage of sexual assault and sexual abuse happens at the hands of males, I think that it would be, I think that probably the best first step there would be talking to young boys about how to talk openly about this stuff, and also how to communicate in a relationship, like either in a sexual relationship or just in friendships and relationships in general. I think that men are expected to sort of shut down emotions, not express very much emotion, and being vulnerable and that kind of thing is generally understood as culturally as kind of like a weakness, right? It's effeminate or whatever. So I think that teaching boys how to communicate and how to be vulnerable and how to access their emotions would probably be a really great basis for also eventually teaching them like what consent means. What does it mean to actually communicate with the person that you are being intimate with, and the fact that that is not something that is unmanly or uncool, but it's something that is in fact manly and cool to do, right? It's like it's the right thing to do. Does that answer your question at all? Okay, good.
Oh, now I got lots of people. All right.
Is there any sort of a program at the University of Idaho that exposes men and women who are perhaps less informed than one would like to what Natalie was just talking about? In the fraternities or in the living groups or anything like that?
I'm going to defer this question to Becca because she's involved in that program.
Yeah, so at U of I, a few offices, including the Women's Center, collaborate on a program called Got Sex. So it's a sexual health education series. So every month we invite somebody to come and talk on a topic in the Women's Center, in our lounge. It's really casual. We make it as comfortable as possible. And that person talks on a topic, whether that is safer sex, meaning, how to, what contraceptives are out there, or just exploring your own sexuality. We pick topics based on what students tell us anonymously that they want to know about. And then we do that once a month, and anybody is welcome to come. And while we do that program, we have different ways that students can interact. They can raise their hand and ask us questions. We also pass around note cards. We collect, so if they want to do it that way. And then we also use Poll Everywhere so that students can text in questions I'm usually sitting up at the front with a laptop. So they can text in questions anonymously, and I just get these questions in quotes, and then I can ask the presenter that question. So that is something that we do. And then also we have mental health education at U of I who promotes safe sex, talking about sex, how to get tested, things like that. In fact, April is Get Yourself Tested month. So we do have some things like that going on.
But is there any so you get people that want to come to those monthly sessions, and that sounds great. But is there anything that actually brings this information to a fraternity and they're required to listen to it? Because let's face it, you don't get, how many 18 or 19-year-old men come to
We actually get quite a few, but we actually get quite a few young men who come to those programs. But fraternities have requirements. They have a risk officer in their houses, and they have requirements. They have to have a certain amount of presentations every semester to keep their house open. And people who can provide those presentations are the Women's Center, Alternatives to Violence. So yes, we are going in and talking to fraternities specifically about consent.
And just to add, I came in 2011, but during youth student orientation, there was a whole presentation on consent and on all that stuff, which went pretty in-depth, at least from the legal and ethical mechanics of it.
The University of Idaho takes this pretty seriously. They were on a list of like, the worst 50 universities for this topic. And since then, I think they've been doing a pretty good job of ramping up programming and all sorts of different support systems. I'm trying to pick people who can talk. Yes.
Okay, one thing that you had mentioned, you know, both the person who contacted you who didn't know if they were being abused, and also when you were 14, you didn't know. You know, okay, how would, like, what is a way, because like, even with, you know, being educated on the subject, you still might not really know what's abuse, you know, because, you know, depending on what, you know, what that social circle is, your family is involved in, some things might be okay and some things might not be, but, you know, all the same, certain things are abuse. So like, how would you go about, I guess, in the educating, how would you go about, you know, also educating how to know what is
How
abuse?
do you know what is abuse and sort of give victims of abuse, like visibility of information, that kind of things, that sort of thing?
Like, or even also people who aren't victims.
Okay,
Like,
yeah.
Or like, okay, so like say like with your kids,
Yeah,
you know, when they're, you know, in their teens,
Yeah.
or whatever, early teens.
Yeah.
You know.
yeah, no, I think I see what you're
They
saying.
know what would be abuse.
Yeah, for me, the answer is talking about it. I actually told my kids the rudimentary version of my own story of abuse about 3 weeks ago at the dinner table. And I think that while we need to educate our kids about like what respectful relationships look like and that kind of thing, that obviously we need to educate them about the flip side too. And I think one of the most powerful, applicable ways and accessible ways to do that is through storytelling. You know, it's one thing to sort of get information and have someone tell you, this could happen, and if it does, here's what you should do. I think it's more effective to tell stories. We all love stories. It's how we learn. Stories can be very engaging. And so I told my kids, I mean, I doubt that my 1-year-old was listening, but my 5 and 7-year-old were gripped. And I told them that, you know, I basically said when mommy was 13, I met somebody that I thought was really nice. And I didn't know that they actually weren't a very nice person, and they hurt me. And when they started to hurt me, you know, what do you think I did? And they both stopped, and my daughter said, well, you told your mom. No, I didn't tell my mom. You didn't? No. And she said, why? I said, well, you know, I was really scared, and I didn't know how to tell my mommy. And we ended up having this whole discussion about it that I actually didn't even, I can't remember how it came up, but I didn't mean for it to come up. I think we were talking about stranger danger or something, and then I was like, well, sometimes people that we know can also be dangerous to us, and that's important. You know, we always have to be, you know, talk to mommy and daddy, and it makes you feel uncomfortable and stuff, even if it's somebody that you know. So my answer to that would be becoming more comfortable talking and telling our stories. Because I think when we tell our own stories of suffering or pain or abuse or whatever it is that we unfortunately may have experienced, that can teach our children or people who haven't been through abuse some really great things about what abuse looks like. And it's a good question because abuse, for people that have not experienced abuse, it looks quite different than most people would think it does. And there's so many different, you know, flavors, shapes, and sizes of abuse, and it's all awful. But it usually looks quite a lot different than you would think that it does. So I really think through storytelling and through sharing our own experiences and becoming more comfortable doing that.
It is much more common for people being mistreated by people that they know.
Yeah.